Hello all, welcome to this session. In this session, I'm going to answer one of the Java interview questions. That is, what are unchecked exceptions in Java? Let me answer. There are two types of exceptions in Java. One are checked exceptions and the other one are unchecked exceptions. Coming to the checked exceptions, they are checked by the compiler before you run the code. Whenever you write some code in Java program, and if Java compiler feels that in this particular code, there is some line of code where on running that line of code, there is a possibility of getting an exception after running. So Java compiler will detect the possibility of exception in advance before you run the code. Okay, such kind of exceptions which are identified by the Java compiler before you run the code itself are called as checked exceptions. Coming to the question here, that is, what are unchecked exceptions? So as the name speaks, these are not checked by the compiler. Even though there is a possibility of getting an exception in the output after running the code, still Java compiler will not suggest you that this particular line you may get this exception. Java compiler will not suggest you. Such exceptions which are unchecked by the compiler before you run the code are called as unchecked exceptions. There are different examples for unchecked exceptions like arithmetic exception, array index out of bounds exception, null pointer exception, number format exception, okay, and many other kind of input mismatch exceptions, and many are there, guys. These are the famous ones anyhow. So for all these exceptions, right, you will only see them after running the code, but compiler will not suggest you in advance that there is a possibility of the exception. To understand the answer for this question in a better way, I'm going to show you the examples, okay? So in a practical way, so by writing some Java code, for that I'll go to one of the project, guys. And in the project, I'll go to one of the package. I'll say IJ here. I'll create a new sample class with some random name. I'm going to right click and create a new class. Fine. I'll just name this class as class 15, and with main method I'll create. The moment I create a class here, inside the main method, I'm going to write some code where Java compiler, before running the code itself, it will state that there's a possibility of exception here. For example, if I write thread dot sleep, okay, if I write this thread dot sleep, where sleep is one of the predefined static method of the thread predefined class in Java. Here I'll give something like 3000 milliseconds, okay. So here, when you hover the mouse, you see the Java compiler is already giving you an error message, compiler error message, stating that at this particular line, there is a possibility of which exception? Interrupted exception is possible. Okay, there's a possibility of interrupted exception because of this line. So better you surround this with try catch block, like that Java compiler is suggesting you. So this kind of exceptions, for example, which type of exception it is saying that there is a possibility Java compiler interrupted exception. If Java compiler is suspecting or detecting the possibility of exception before you run the code, such kind of exceptions will come under checked exception category, because Java compiler is checking that the possibility of this exception is there or not in the code before you run the code. This interrupted exception will fall under the checked exception because they are checked by the compiler before you run the code. Okay. Similar to interrupted exception, we have IO exception and many other type of exceptions, guys, that Java compiler generally checks before running the code. Okay. Now, if I write some other code in place of this, if I write some other code like int a is equal to 9 divided by 0 and system.out.println a. I'll print the value of the a, and system.out.println. I'll simply write down end of this program. Okay. I'll just write down here saying end of this program. Like this, I'll write the code, guys. Okay, like this, I'm going to write the code. Now tell me what's going to happen here. So is the Java compiler suggesting us there is a possibility of exception when you try to divide a number by 0? But in Java, it's not possible to divide a number by 0, guys. But still, if you try to divide a number by 0, Java compiler is not suggesting that there's a possibility of arithmetic exception here. You can clearly see with your eyes you are trying to divide a number by 0, but still Java is not going to give you an exception, guys. Okay. Java is not going to suggest you that there is a possibility of exception. You see, no Java compiler error is coming here. No Java compiler error is coming here. So that means what exception will be possible here when I run this code? after I run the code in the output, I'm going to get arithmetic exception because in Java, it's not possible to divide a number by 0. That's the reason I'm going to get an arithmetic exception here, guys. Okay. But Java compiler is not suggesting that there's a possibility of arithmetic exceptions around this with try catch block handling. Nothing is being given, instructions are given by Java. Hence, you see, you can run the code without the Java compiler suggestions, and because it's not checked by the compiler, the possibility of exception will come definitely. Arithmetic exception will come in the output at the line 7, you see, because you're trying to divide a number by 0. That's the reason. The name of the exception is arithmetic exception. And at the line 7, this particular line is causing the exception. And because of which the remaining lines have not got executed because Java execution stopped here because compiler has not given us a suggestion stating that there is a possibility of exception in this particular line. Such kind of exceptions for which Java compiler will not inform you in advance before you run the code by giving some compiler errors. Okay, by not giving the compiler errors. In this case of unchecked exceptions, compiler errors are not coming because Java compiler is not suggesting us. Such kind of exceptions will fall into the other type, that is unchecked exceptions category, because they are not checked by the compiler. Okay, only the exceptions like interrupted exception, IO exception, file not found exception, like that many exceptions are there, which will be detected by the compiler before you run the code. Those are called as checked exceptions. But the kind of exceptions which are not detected by the compiler while writing the code, and after running only will encounter that exception in the runtime, that is in the output after the program is run. That kind of exceptions which are not checked by the compiler are called as unchecked exceptions. Example for the unchecked exceptions are arithmetic exception, array index out of bounds exception, null pointer exception, input mismatch exception, and many other type of exceptions, like are there in input mismatch exception, and number format exception, and many other, guys. The list will go on, but hope guys you got an idea what exactly are unchecked exceptions in Java. With practical demonstration, I've answered this question for you. So that's all for this session. Thank you. Bye bye.